Well, I think we better get started, even though people may still be eating, but we need to stay on schedule. So my name is Mike Ripley, and I'm going to introduce Elliot Nelson. Elliot Nelson is an extension educator with Michigan Sea Grant. So it's a cooperative program for the University of Michigan and Michigan State University Extension. Elliot works to bring science to coastal communities to help them achieve economic and environmental sustainability. Elliot's work is primarily in the areas of aquaculture, K-12 Great Lakes literacy, and ecotourism. Elliot serves the 6 eastern counties of the Upper Peninsula through his office at Lake Superior State University. So we're happy to have Elliot here today to talk about islands and wetlands in the eastern UP and the birds that call them home.
Yeah. So you guys have good talks today, then?
Yeah.
Where else? What else did you do?
I went to the Arabian and the history of natives.
Oh yeah, I really wanted to come up for that. If I didn't have a small child at home that was grabbing me.
They will post that on the Sierra Club website.
Oh, okay. Are all these being filmed? I'm being
I know
filmed.
that one is being filmed, that one is.
I don't know.
You may not.
Maybe I should push play.
I don't know.
Record.
They're not filming you there.
Nice. What else did you guys go to?
There was water trails.
Oh.
Of the Lake Superior. There's going to be one this afternoon. More than water.
Invasive species.
Oh, with Nick Castle? Yeah, he's a great guy. I do some work about that. Yeah. Well, I'm going to talk about birds. As you heard, I work for Michigan Sea Grant. Although I will admit birds are much more than just part of my job. It does interact with ecotourism. I do a lot of work with birding trails around the state and some birding festivals and promoting bird tourism in the state of Michigan. But I also obsessively chase birds of the state, rare birds. I'm a huge birder. I really like to see a lot. I'm almost in the top 10 for this year for the number of species. It's just barely at 11 right now. So there's still some time to go though, so I'm going to keep birding. So I really like to bird. And I love to share about the birds of this region. I'm very fortunate I get to wrap some of that in. Just so you know, Sea Grant is a program through NOAA. As Mike said, it's through 2 universities, and I love that we also have a partnership here at LSSU. Our office is, we have an office here. I am the office. But I'm housed here at LSSU. I do a lot of work with their Robotic Research Lab, Dr. Barbara Evans, and a variety of other folks in the area. Just a lot of work also with Bay Mills Community College. Mike and I have done some stuff together as well for us. So, this is a really neat job where I get to work with local partners and try to help them do what they do best. And so it's sort of help build capacity and enhance what people are already doing in the area by bringing science and NOAA resources to the table. And so it's a really neat job, and it involves research, education, and outreach. We have 4 focus areas at Sea Grant. Fisheries and aquaculture, that's one of my big areas. We do a lot of work in aquaculture. We do resilient communities and economies, so that's everything from climate resilience to economic resilience, healthy coastal ecosystems, a lot of restoration work, and then a lot of work on environmental and literacy and workforce development, working in K-12 schools, help getting Great Lakes literacy into the schools and into people's minds so they understand the region they live in. So it's a neat place, and we do have educators that live around the whole state. So we're on Pinions, we're in Marquette, Market Region, Traverse City, Alpena, West Olive, serves the Southwest region, and we have an office in Ann Arbor and in Dickinson. So really, really neat organization. If you have more questions about Sea Grant, answer. All right, I'm going to interact with you guys a little bit. I don't want to do all the talking here, so we're going to do some trivia. You're going to have to answer some trivia questions. Ready? All right. I can't do all the talking, okay? And by the way, if you have questions at any point, please feel free to interject. Or if you have something that you've experienced about birds in here, I'd love to hear from you guys too, because I'm always learning about new things about the birds in the region here. So feel free to chime in at any point. But I'm going to start with this. Okay, rank the Great Lakes by surface area. Who thinks they can do it? Well, a few of you can. You gonna give it a try? Okay. By surface.
Superior.
Okay. Yeah. Superior.
Now, the next one is, I think it's Michigan.
Michigan. All right.
Huron, Ontario, Erie.
How do you guys think it's right?
I would
Superior. We're on Michigan, Erie, Ontario. Got those last two. Really? Yeah. I'll show some pictures of that. All right. Well, yeah, Erie actually has a little bit more surface area. If you look at the western basin here, that kind of adds that extra surface area on. So, that one I already gave you the answer to, right up there. All right. So if you look at it by volume, though, then you kind of flip a couple. Here on a Michigan flip and Erie on Ontario. So by the amount of water, they're a little different. All right, next one. Rank them by the maximum depth from shallowest to deepest lake. Who wants to take that one? Mike wants to do that one?
Superior, Ontario.
Ontario. Oh.
Michigan, you're on Erie.
I think you got it right. Nice. Yeah.
Oh,
You went the other way.
Oh, okay,
yeah,
sorry.
Superior, Ontario, Michigan, Huron, Erie, or the other way around if you want shallows. But
Ontario?
yes, I know, right? Like we don't really know.
Michigan is like a 900 foot.
Yeah, I know. You would think that. Oh shoot, you're right. You're right. I got it backwards. Ontario is 802. Shoot, I forgot about that super deep part there. So I did have it backwards. So yes, Michigan, then Ontario. At least according to this chart. I don't know. But Ontario is really deep. It's really close between Michigan and Ontario. So I did have those backwards. But Ontario, I never realized is so deep. I don't really think about Ontario because it doesn't touch Michigan, so it doesn't matter. Yeah, so anyway, I'm just kind of pointing out, one last one. How much Great Lake coastline is there? Around the same as the Atlantic and New England coastline? Do we have the same amount of coastline as the U.S. Gulf of Mexico? Do we have the same as the U.S. whole Atlantic coastline? Or do we have the same as the whole Atlantic and the Gulf combined? This is Great Lakes coastline, shore. All right, on the count of three, stick up a finger. 1, 2, 3, or 4 for A, B, C, or D. 1, 2, 3, go. Boy, you guys can't be fooled. Yes, D. We have more shoreline than the entire eastern seaboard and the Gulf of Mexico. Fine. That is, I mean, at low tide, right, technically. So at high tide, it is. The amount of shoreline on the oceans varies a lot more than ours. But at low tide. And we actually have more shoreline than any other state but Alaska and Michigan specifically. So we have a lot of shoreline. So all that to say, we have this amazing resource in the Great Lakes here. We have this amazing amount of shoreline. We have over 35,000 islands. As that's part of why we have so much coastline, right? All that coastline, all those islands, and huge islands, Manitoulin Islands and Lake Huron is the largest lake island in the world. Sugar Island is one of the largest river islands. I think it's the largest river island in the whole Great Lakes region, one of the largest in the country. So we have very big islands that creates a lot of shoreline. The question is, do the birds like this stuff? Does this matter to the birds? And where are they if they are in this area? Well, the answer obviously is yes. We have a huge amount of diversity in Michigan in terms of our breeding birds, but especially in terms of our migratory birds that pass through in the fall and the spring. Part of that diversity is definitely because of the amount of water. And we'll get into that. That's where our focus is on the water and the islands and the wetlands and how those interact with our bird species and why they're so important. The other part of the reason too is that Michigan is a really interesting place in terms of our climate. If you go down to southern Michigan, you can find breeding birds down here like hooded warbler, warm-meaty warbler, yellow-breasted chat. These are birds that are typically associated with more southern regions. But we have some of this sort of southern warm, some of these really wet, like ash forests and sassafras and these kind of more southerly trees. But by the time you get up here, you're seeing things like spruce grouse and black-backed woodpeckers and gray jays and boreal chickadees. None of those species you see down here. We have this huge thermocline here, this really dramatic climate gradient. They really split kind of right around the 45th parallel from this northern climate to almost a more southern, and even some prairies down here. I mean, Michigan is just an amazing place with a huge diversity of habitats. And because of that, we have a huge diversity of breeding birds that can be found throughout the state. When I do my Michigan big years, where you try to see as many species in 1 year as you can, I have to cross like the whole state because there are species that breed up here that I can only find, like I said, like the boreal chickadee. I have to go all the way over to Marquette to find that. And then if I want to see a worm-eating warbler or a yellow-throated warbler, I have to go right down here to the border of Michigan, and that's where I can find a yellow-throated warbler. So, you know, just a huge diversity, a lot of different cool stuff to see in Michigan. But, you know, and the water, I'll get to this here. You know, the water itself, though, actually is kind of a big unknown. Most of this open water, we don't have a lot of bird species, migratory or that are here to breed, that utilize this massive open water area. They've done aerial surveys of a lot of the birds, and actually what a lot of the water birds are using are much near shore areas, much closer to shore. When you start getting way out there, part of it is we don't have a lot of monitoring. Not a lot of people are out here bird watching. But we also think there's not quite as many species utilizing that really far offshore area in terms of birds. But it is kind of an unknown area, and certainly some birds do over that water. But it's a lot of the nearshore areas. And so part of those nearshore areas really mean that we have a lot of really important habitat for water birds. So there's this designation called the Important Bird Areas by the Audubon Society. They designate nationally, actually internationally I think, some of these very key important areas for bird species. And what you see is that in the East, in the UP, we have quite a few of these. The reds and the greens are all important bird areas, and a lot of them are water-based areas. All these big circles here, here, here. There's some small ones you can't see because of the scale here, here. And that's because basically I kind of categorize the islands and wetlands into three main importance. One is that these nearshore areas here are really important for migrating ducks and geese and things like that. They will stop and fuel up on that water and stay on that water, and they actually don't migrate until it starts to freeze. So they kind of, ducks and geese a lot of times will migrate as things freeze. They'll just migrate down as ice keeps freezing and freezing. So they are very fall, slow migrants. And they'll stop and they'll hang out, and I'll talk about some of that, the amount of birds that are stopping. But yeah, so these nearshore areas, especially in eastern UP here, because we have so many wonderful protected bays and points and things, are really important. The other thing is that Lake Superior really acts as a funnel, and the shorelines act as a funnel. So water birds don't mind water, but hawks and small little warblers and passerines, they do have an issue with water. They don't actually like to cross large expanses of water. Owls as well. And so these shorelines actually act as funnels. And we'll kind of talk about the funnel effect that happens here at Whitefish Point. But for those birds, they kind of follow the shoreline until they get to a point where they can cross, like here at the Straits, or up here at Whitefish Point, or in the Keweenaw is another major funnel point. And so birds are concentrated around these areas. So those areas where they're in high concentrations, their habitat is super important for them because you're getting all these birds concentrated there. If habitat gets disrupted, it affects a proportionally large amount of birds that pass through Michigan. Again, this is during migration. And then our final kind of important bird areas here have to do a lot with our islands and wetlands because very unique species utilize those really critically important habitats. So those are the three things I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to get more in depth with those, but think of those three things: the funnel, the nearshore areas, migrating birds using the water. Then we have the funnel effect, the shorelines themselves and the islands, and then we have this sort of wetlands and islands as breeding habitat. Those are our three sort of focuses for today. Yeah.
Just curious what the difference between the red and the green is.
I was trying to remember it, and they don't have a key on their website, on their map. I know a lot of I know what they are, but I can't remember why some of them are red. It might be because it's associated with a specific endangered species, but I can't recall exactly something. Yeah, I don't know either. And yeah, this just kind of points out what I've been talking about with these sort of migration pathways. So we talk about breeding birds, but we also talk about migration. And the other really interesting thing why we're so diverse, before I really get to those three, is if you look, these are some of the main flyways for birds that migrate. A lot of birds spend their summer up in the tundra area where the resources are very rich for a short amount of time. Tons of bugs are hatching in the tundra when it thaws. And so they're up there utilizing those resources, and then they go back south for the winter. And there's kind of what we consider the Mississippi flyway, where a lot of birds follow the Mississippi and go out to the Delta. And there's the Atlantic flyways here. The birds kind of hop over from Hudson Bay or this way. And so we actually have a kind of a convergence in the Great Lakes where we get birds from the Mississippi and the Atlantic flyway. So just again emphasizing how diverse it is here. Oh, mix this up just a little bit. So as I was talking about, yeah, so you can see a lot of these big areas up here of water kind of are channeling birds down here, and so again, we're seeing this as a funnel. And Lake Superior too, if you could imagine birds following along here, kind of get either follow along the shorelines like that, or if they're water birds, they cross the water and kind of get funneled down by the water. So one of the main kind of things that birds that are migrating that utilize the shorelines for, this is just kind of an aside, are to refuel at certain points. And so does anyone know what that bug is? Looks like a mosquito, and a lot of people will be walking along in May on our rocky shorelines here and think that there are swarms of mosquitoes all over the place. But it's not a mosquito. It actually doesn't even have a mouth. It's a midge, yes. This is a midge. So one of the reasons our shorelines are so important for these migratory birds, particularly songbirds, is that when they're getting funneled, like I talked about, through these kind of migration pinch points here, you know, when they're coming up north, they're going to be crossing maybe a large expanse of water here, or a large expanse of water here, and they're going to be landing on there. Sometimes the birds actually, they've done some studies, will actually pick up here and then at nighttime fly hundreds of miles up high in the sky along the shoreline. But when that dawn hits, when it gets daylight out, they actually stop migrating. They're night migrants, most of these little birds, and they will land on these rocky shorelines here, and these migration funnel points, same reverse when they're going this way on these funnel points. And the amazing thing is that they're, especially in the springtime, their migration is timed up with the hatching of these little birds. So these birds that have just flown hundreds of miles and just crossed a huge expanse of water are exhausted, drained of resources, and they're about to go lay their eggs and raise their young. And so it's a very critical time for them, but the great thing is here, especially up in the eastern UP, we have massive hatches of these things at the exact time that these birds are coming and landing. It's just an incredible, you know, amazing, beautiful phenomenon that happens. The birds obviously are timing their migrations with the outbreak of these things. So if you go along in May, you just touch any woody vegetation along a rocky shoreline, particularly Lake Huron down there, but some of the same areas, Lake Superior areas up here too, you will see these birds just come off in a cloud. And actually, Dave York from the Nature Conservancy did some amazing studies. You know, most people assume these birds that were landing on the shorelines wanted to get inland right away because the water's cold and it's a little warmer inland, right? And so there's actually more leaves inland. The leaves along the shoreline haven't come out yet. But when they were doing these studies, they were finding the birds were concentrated right on the edge of the water, and that was because they were feeding heavily upon these midges refueling before they continued on their way. So this is just one example of how our kind of shorelines, and many of our islands are just these same kind of resource. Beaver Island, Mackinac Island, Lime Island, Sugar Island, they have the same effect, and these birds that need that place to land in the morning when it's dawn are landing there and they're being refueled. You know, if our shorelines are altered, the rocky substrate in particular that these birds or these bugs live on, most of their life is a tiny little midge. When that shoreline's altered and that rocky substrate is removed, those midge populations can go way down. And now these birds that for millennia have been evolved to adapt to this situation aren't getting that refuel. So up here we have particularly done a good job of preserving a lot of our shorelines. From San Yngas to Drummond Island, there's a massive amount of shoreline that is protected by Nature Conservancy, Little Traverse Conservancy, MNA, a plethora of organizations that have committed to protecting a lot of our shorelines. Not every part of the Great Lakes has that advantage, so we're still this critical stopover area, and we continue to strive to protect our shorelines so that they can serve the needs of the birds and many other needs. So that's the passerines there. That's the songbirds that are using that kind of thing. A little bit different is the water birds, which are also being funneled, but in a different way. The shorebirds are following the land, the shoreline. The water birds are trying to follow the water too, but they want to stay in the water, and so they're not crossing the water necessarily. They might be afraid to actually cross the land. It might be the reverse for them. So a lot of them will come across here, shoot across the land as quick as they can, get to the water, and then follow the water out this way, possibly hop over to the Mississippi Delta, or go this way and shoot across the EUP at some point. There's a lot of questions about exactly where, or head off into the Georgian Bay area, down here towards Port Huron, or down along the Michigan shoreline. And it's not something that we always knew about. It's something that we have learned over time, that a lot of birds are doing this, that they're using the Great Lakes as this basically highway during migration. One of the first places in the Great Lakes to really document that a lot of water birds are doing this, because again, people back in the 70s, 60s didn't know that water birds were using the Great Lakes in highways, especially certain rare species. When they started doing counts at Whitefish Point, they were learning, wow, we've got something really interesting happening here. So Whitefish Point is right here, and every spring and fall, a guy sits out, or a girl sits out on the point, and in a little waterbird shack, they call it, and gets a scope and counts every bird that goes by. And they've been doing this since the 1980s. It's not exactly an easy thing to do if you know Lake Superior in like November, because they're there like August through the end of November, and they're there, I think in April, late March, early April through the end of May. So they're not exactly pleasant times to just sit outside doing nothing but counting birds, but they've been very dedicated and have really dedicated counters. And when they started doing the counts, what they were finding were species of birds that are normally associated with oceans, that are not typically associated with Michigan or even the Great Lakes. And they were finding these birds in higher numbers than they ever thought. So things like scoters, which I don't have a picture of, these are red-throated loons, always associated as an ocean loon, not as an inland bird, but they were finding them. And then most significantly, red-necked grebes, which are a beautiful bird. Grebes have lobed feet instead of webbed feet, so each one of their toes is actually like a little paddle. They're all separate. Really, really cool how they move them around. But when they started counting, people weren't believing how many grebes they were seeing. They were seeing tens of thousands of grebes. They actually were seeing numbers higher than any other count in the country of these redneck grebes, a bird that most people assumed was using oceans as their main pathway. But here at Whitefish Point, they were getting numbers so high that the first couple of seasons no one believed them. So they continued to document and continued to show, and I've been up there and I've seen hundreds of these birds fly by in a day. And what they were finding is that these grebes are using the Great Lakes, and actually, with further research, they're using a lot of Georgian Bay in the winter time to fuel up and recharge these birds that they assumed were more of an ocean bird. So we have these ocean-style birds that are using the Great Lakes as a migratory highway and even as a refueling point for a lot of them. So really cool research that's happened there about those. And again, this particular region in the eastern UP is really a huge funnel for them. It has a lot of bays. So I would say of all the Great Lakes regions, the eastern UP is probably one of the most significant for birds like this. Some other birds that use it in our protected bays and areas. Well, right here in the St. Mary's River, this is from the 1980s, but they did a number of counts all up and down the St. Mary's, and I can say as birding throughout the winter before it freezes over, you go to any of these protected bays or channels and you will find ducks. The cool thing too is that we have such a diversity of habitat. I'm going to talk about these kind of bigger open areas in a second, but the eastern UP in the St. Mary's area actually allows for these things called dabblers, and dabblers are ducks that just dabble around. They just tip upside down, and that's how they feed. They don't dive underwater, so they need shallow water. And so we actually have that in some of our kind of more shallower bays areas like Manusky Bay and places like that, where we actually have pretty decent numbers of American black ducks and mallards, the dabblers. Some of our teal, green-winged teal and blue-winged teal, also spend a significant amount of time in pretty high numbers. And then we also have some divers that are kind of shallower divers like scaup and ringneck duck. And those birds they found in groups of 1,000 to 2,000 hanging out in the St. Mary's River throughout the winter. So we have thousands of these birds that pass through, but thousands of them that don't just pass through, they also stay and feed on these sort of nutrient and food-rich areas around the St. Mary's and the different bays on the St. Mary River here. So really, really cool to know that we have all these ducks out there in the winter. But like I was saying, it's not just the shallow areas. We also have really amazing deep water areas, particularly in the straits out to Drummond Island. Sorry, this has all the lighthouses on it. I couldn't find a picture like this exactly without lighthouses all over it. But anyway, now you know where the lighthouses are. But these areas are a little bit deeper, and they have very strong currents, right? The entirety of Lake Michigan goes here into Lake Huron. Actually, a lot of hydrologists consider it the same lake, but there's a huge amount of water passing through here at high speeds in very strong channels and currents that are going through here. And with that comes nutrient and food for a lot of different species. So the strong channels actually, they've done some studies that they do run in through the Relational Islands as well. There's some very strong ones out here by Detour. And where those are, we see huge congregations of birds. So this one is one of my favorite birds. Anyone know what this one is?
Long-tailed duck.
Long-tailed duck, yes. This bird is another kind of typically associated with it as an ocean bird, but actually uses the Great Lakes in huge numbers all along the Lake Michigan shoreline and up here in the Straits area and passing through Whitefish Point. In particular, I think it's really understudied, but out by Drummond, I've had reports from very credible birders that have done counts of these, counted well over 10,000 long-tailed ducks using the water out there by Drummond Island. And nobody's really done studies or counts out there, but I would assume that's an annual event where there's 10,000 plus long-tailed ducks feeding out in some of these strong current areas. Another understudied one is called a Bonaparte's gull. It's just a beautiful gull. I really like them. Blackheads actually get white in the winter, but they pass through in numbers too, and a very understudied bird. But I've seen these in the Relational Islands, 400 or 500 of them, actually right in the channel that's going into the Relational Islands where there's a strong current. And again, that's not really documented, but I think every year these birds are using those strong current areas. And then one that is pretty well documented is the redhead, which congregate underneath the bridge. As you're driving over the bridge in the winter, look out. If you see something that seems like an oil slick, fingers crossed it's not actually an oil slick. It's probably redheads. And there are so many of them out there that they literally look like a cloud over the water. Some records, I've seen a lot of varied in the numbers, but one I saw as high as 20,000 birds that are using that. I did the Christmas bird count last year, and I went out to Mackinac Island as part of that. And they use a variety of areas around here where the currents go through. But I saw them out in the distance, and I thought it was a cloud at first. But the more I looked, I watched that cloud was shifting and moving. And it's just if you've ever seen those videos of, what is it called, where birds all move together?
Murmuration.
Yes, a murmuration. Well, these redheads will do the murmuration. They're much bigger than a starling, which is normally what you see those videos of. These are, significant sized ducks with a wingspan like this or so. And to see them in a group of 4,000 or 5,000 having a murmuration, it's very, very cool. So again, we have just a spectacular amount of water birds that are using primarily, not as breeding, but as a migratory area, really significant in the spring and in the fall in particular. These sort of nearshore areas, all these islands, these wetlands, these protected bays, these are very important, and also some of the open water areas that are nearshore. So any questions about this sort of funnel effect, the water birds, the nearshore area? Yeah?
They go for the big lakes and they ignore the small lakes, or there's still the same species on the small lakes?
No, so that's a great question. So the small lakes are utilized, but more so by the dabblers, the teal and pintail mallards.
The shallow.
Yeah, those kind of shallow birds. I do see scaup and ring-necked ducks on some of our small lakes, but not in the thousands, right? But they will utilize the small lakes, but those kind of following the big body of water kind of leads them to just stay near the nearshore area. But you go on an inland lake and you'll see waterfowl too. Great question. Other questions? Yeah.
You mentioned the redneck loon. What about the more common one?
Oh yeah, common loons migrate through in significant numbers, and I didn't really get to dive too deep into a study that was done back in the 80s, an ecological survey of the St. Mary's, but they list loons as congregating here. I always see loons out in this part of the St. Mary's when I go birding. The common loons don't congregate in these massive rafts typically, like the other birds will, but they are definitely coming through, and they're coming through Whitefish Point in the hundreds sometimes in a day. So,
North Channel, I always, they stage in the North Channel.
okay.
Commonly. And
Yeah.
you see them, you don't see rafts of them, but you will
Right.
see every several hundred meters, 4, 5, or
Yeah.
6, and it's just traffic.
It's just constant traffic.
So there's a
Yeah.
couple of routes where they seem
Seem to congregate.
to, stage up.
Yeah, and I wonder, so that the North Channel, that's this, which one?
So it's north of Crum.
Yeah, okay, that one, yeah. So yeah, that would make sense, and they documented on Cape them doing the same kind of thing there. So yeah, they're definitely coming through here. It's a good community for them. Other questions? Check my time. All right, good. So that kind of, I think that's one of the most fascinating ones because it's one of the most sort of under-researched areas. It's one of the hardest things to research are migratory birds because they're migrating. You can't follow them very well. But a lot of our counts and studies have shown that this is a super significant area for migratory birds.
So I have a question, more political question, and that is that you mentioned oil. No one has really talked about the effect of the potential oil spill on, so if you've got counts and you've got an awareness, that's never been matched up with if they do analyses of
Yeah.
the risks.
Yeah, I'm not too involved with the risk analyses, or I haven't really read them. My colleague Mark Breerlin with Seagrain has done a lot more with the advisor, or one of the advisory committees looking at some of that stuff. But yeah, I mean, that's a significant thing, and they do aerial surveys every winter of that nearshore area around the straits and find massive congregations of redheads and mergansers and long-tailed ducks. So they're definitely there, and if there was oil, they would be in trouble.
Part of the contingency plan for an oil spill in the Straits of Mackinac is to haze the birds to keep them away from an oil slick, which is, I don't know how effective that would be, but that's what Fish and Wildlife Service is planning to do.
And it's a bird. It's a bird one.
Yeah, that would probably be from like too.
Connected with the oil and past water pollution and current water pollution on the North Channel and or downriver from Algoma. How has that proceeded, and is that a significant thing, and has it changed?
Yeah, I can't say that I've read the specific studies that are trying to link pollution specifically from this region to some of these populations that are in large numbers. While they do spend a significant amount of time here in the terms of weeks or maybe a month, they're not spending as much time here as they do on their breeding grounds or their wintering grounds kind of shift as the ice freezes. So bioaccumulation would be how they would typically get most of that. So things that chemicals that get into the insects, then into the fish, as the fish eat the insects, and then the birds as the birds eat the fish. If that bioaccumulation is being seen, then it's definitely happening in these bird species that are spending time here. But I don't know of any studies that are showing that there's significant die-offs of birds related to that or struggle with reproduction. Most of these populations are somewhat stable. Actually, redheads have grown quite significantly. Their populations have grown. But some of them are in jeopardy, and actually it's not necessarily being linked to chemical pollutants, but to a biological issue with botulism. So some of these birds are in big trouble, particularly common loons and long-tailed ducks, and some of our merganser species. And that is happening, they think, possibly in this region. It's definitely happening along Lake Michigan. And botulism is tied to a complex food web, but essentially it's passing up the food chain just like a pollutant would, and it might be connected possibly to our increasing invasive mussels and brown gobies that eat the mussels and then birds eating the brown gobies, getting the botulism toxin. So we've seen huge die-offs of loons, and they actually do counts all along Lake Michigan. We don't have any counts in Lake Huron, and I would hazard a guess that if we started counting they count beaches, dead birds on beaches is how they do it. And they've done this along Lake Michigan, and they're seeing some years are really bad for botulism outbreaks and die-offs of common loons and long-tailed ducks. I don't think the Loon Network does any counts on Lake Huron, but I would hazard a guess if we started counting, we might find that botulism is also affecting them on Lake Huron and possibly Lake Superior as well. But Lake Michigan, it's very well documented that there are certain years where the botulism. So that's one of the significant issues that we're worried about right now, along, of course, with habitat loss is always an issue. So. Right. Did you have another question?
Yeah, well, related to that, the depth of the water and the live population of plants associated with that. So and it's a complicated issue.
It is.
So
yeah.
Maybe
if there's contaminants in the water, then odds are it's probably ending up with some of these birds, affecting some of them. But yeah, the populations of birds I showed that are most at risk of seeing decline are common loons, some of the long-tailed ducks. Those ones have seen significant decline. So. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit. We're going to whiz through islands and wetlands. We're talking a lot about the kind of near-shore areas and migratory water birds. But you know, we have islands here that are homes to colony breeders, birds that breed in large colonies. And our islands are really quite awesome places. And I'm not talking about our bigger islands most of the time. I'm talking about our small, uninhabited islands, somewhere you might think that place doesn't matter at all. It's like, you know, the size of this room or even smaller than that. But it actually might be home to a huge number of birds that are breeding there. And so a couple different places. One in particular, right in the Straits of Mackinac, there's a little tiny island right next to the bridge. Right, you can drive out to Point LeBarge here on Boulevard Drive and see this island. It's called Green Island, and Green Island is home to one of the largest breeding populations of ring-billed gulls and herring gulls in the entire Great Lakes. Some counts have counted over 10,000 breeding birds, ring-billed gulls on this little island, and over 2,000 herring gulls. It's one of the highest breeding populations of herring gulls in the Great Lakes. I know gulls aren't super exciting to a lot of people. I think they're really fascinating birds. They're insanely good at surviving and adapting to their situations. And there are actually quite a few more species than most people realize. Everyone calls them seagulls. I never call them seagulls because we don't live in the sea here. We're in the lakes. We just call them gulls. That's good. But this is a herring gull. We have ring-billed gulls. Those are our two main species. And they really are very prevalent on a lot of our islands here. And a lot of those little islands are important breeding areas. And they've done studies too about contaminants in these birds. This has been a really important area for tracking PCBs and lead and mercury levels. A number of studies have taken place on there where they're harvesting some eggs, looking at the health of those and the amount of contaminants. And it's been a kind of a good place to monitor what's happening in the Great Lakes wide, because these birds range around a lot in the winter. So really important area. We also have huge breeding significant, I wouldn't say as huge, right here in St. Mary's. If you go to Sugar Island, you look out on those tiny little islands all to the north end of Sugar Island, they all have a lot of gulls in them, and they're breeding them. Another cool colony breeder, it's a special concern species in Michigan, is the black-crowned night heron. And we're right at the northern extent of their habitat, and so actually most people didn't think they bred up here, that they have breeding colonies, but my friend Caleb Putnam, who does the bird areas up here, found on Bear Island, which is a little island right by Cedarville, Hessel area, right actually out in front of the quarry there, has a decent population of these. And then myself and Joseph Lottenbach, a Sioux tribe biologist, have documented a really, not a huge colony, pretty small, but another colony of these birds right in the St. Mary's River, over here by the ferry. There's a tiny little island right there. You wouldn't think much of it, but it has about 20 or 30 of these birds nesting out there, these special concern birds. So just pointing out that, these tiny little islands that we think, these things are just scrappy little places. These pretty rare birds, these black-crowned night herons, are using these. Also, of course, our great blue herons are using them, the big ones that you see a lot more often. Double-crested cormorants are using them. I know it's not a popular bird, but they are using them. They're a native species. It's part of the ecosystem that's using them. And the gulls are using them. So a lot of birds are using these little islands. Yeah?
Yeah, I go by Bear Island a lot. I'm just curious,
Bear or crow, I can't remember. It's one of those.
well, yeah,
I think it's
two of
crow,
them
but
pretty close together.
Yeah.
Probably both, maybe. They
Yeah.
seem to. How do they coexist with other species? Like when we have the cormorants,
Yeah.
big numbers, does that kind of force them?
So I've heard some people try to make the case that cormorants, kick out these other species because they kill off the island with all their poop and things like that. I think it's more complicated than that. I think I've seen, right on this little island here, cormorants, great blue herons, and all three nesting on this actually small island. So all three species, and maybe even some gulls nesting on that island. So they definitely are doing these things together in some areas. Some islands you'll see dominated by a particular species. But the other thing is these islands have to have just the right mix of vegetation and rocky areas. And so if the water levels aren't changing or if vegetation isn't dying off from time to time, then those islands become unsuitable habitat. Too much vegetation can be a predator risk for some of these birds that nest very low or on the ground. And so if you don't have the die-off of the vegetation from time to time, and these islands kind of regenerating, you're not going to have the appropriate habitat. So while the cormorants definitely can devastate an island, and numbers that are so big that are devastating all the islands probably would have a significantly negative impact on some of the birds, no cormorants, on the flip side of things, might mean that we're not seeing the regeneration, these die-off and regenerations of some of these islands. So it's a balancing act. It's all about what were the levels like in the past and what should they be now. And too many definitely could be an impact for humans, but too few. Yeah. Cormorants are a really sticky issue, though.
I'm just gonna ask you, native or non-native cormorants?
Cormorants are a native species. They're a native species
To this area?
As far as I know, yes. It's documentation back from prior to the 1800s that they were in this area. The question is, how many were here in the past? And is that similar to what we have now? What's their impact? And obviously we care about a variety of things in the Great Lakes, and recreational fishing is very important, so what's the impact on that is a huge question, but they're a native species, so, and they have a legacy issue of being demonized. You can see articles and stuff from the early mid-1800s about the black devils, they call them. And, just similar to wolves, how there's a long history of humans kind of villainizing wolves. There's a long history of humans villainizing cormorants in the western world, I should say. So it's a very complex, very sticky issue, and nowadays it's tied in with a lot of emotions and a lot of cultural values that a variety of people have that are different. And so it's very hard to piece out the science from the values issues that are happening. Yeah.
To what extent is the level of the water regulated at the Sioux Log?
And how does that impact some of these islands? I'm going to get to wetlands in a second, and that will kind of come up to play then. So I'll answer that question about lake levels then, if I can. We got to move though. All right, one more species. We got 13 minutes left. So this is another state threatened species, the common tern, a beautiful, elegant little species that uses our islands or actually some of the nearshore areas. And this is again an example of a species that needs no vegetation or very little vegetation, rocky areas. So some birds need the trees to nest in, like the heron. This bird needs rocky, low vegetation areas. Right here is the Coast Guard dock in St. Ignace. This is the bridge here. And this is the Coast Guard dock. And that's, at least a couple years ago, was home to the largest breeding colony of common terns in the upper Great Lakes, pushing, I think, 500 birds or something, 500 breeding pairs or something like that, maybe 300 breeding pairs. Anyway, it's a very large colony, cool cooperative between Fish and Wildlife and Coast Guard. They've actually taken this dock here and put an electric barrier here so that raccoons and other predators can't get to them. And it's a nice cooperative agreement there. And you can go to this dock, which is a city park, and you can look right over and see these beautiful birds in the hundreds nesting and raising from there. But the Lime Island colony, which Lime Island is in the lower St. Mary's, I'm going to zoom in right there. This was another area home to the largest breeding colony in the entire Great Lakes. I think it was about 700 breeding pairs, so 1,400 birds there, right on an old coal dock, actually. And just like that, they're using some of these man-made structures because they don't have a lot of vegetation. They're flat. They're the kind of habitat they need. But this is a bird that's been in a lot of jeopardy, and we're not entirely sure why. That population went from the largest colony in the Great Lakes to gone. The birds were disappeared because of predation, a flooding event that occurred, and there's some other theories about why they disappeared, but that population completely disappeared because these areas that they nest, they need a very specific thing, and they are willing to abandon those areas if they're too disturbed. They did come back, and now you can go back and there's actually, the numbers are growing again at that location. And they're actually, I think vegetation was growing up so much on it, it was another reason they left. Now they're doing some management to keep that tern colony back.
That is fenced as well.
Yeah, it's fenced now. I don't know if it always was or not. I don't know all the history, but they've been studying that population for a long time. But the numbers of these birds have been going down statewide significantly. Michigan, I think, went from 6,000 pairs in the Great Lakes to 1,500. They were down to at one point from like the early 90s to the early 2000s. So not exactly sure why the populations are declining. Still a lot of research, but might have to do with habitat loss primarily and predation. But they're coming back on that Lime Island, but they're strong on the coal dock one, so there's work happening. Okay, so wetlands provide many ecological services. I'm not going to have a lot of time to talk a lot about wetlands, but wetlands are talked about a lot, and I can answer questions. But one thing I want to point out, and this actually has to do, well, yeah, you probably know the benefits of wetlands. They filter and clean water, they store and cycle nutrients, they prevent flooding and erosion, and they have the highest biodiversity of all Michigan ecosystems. No ecosystem in Michigan has more biodiversity than the wetlands. They are super important for our sports fish. That's where they breed, or the young are raised. Our bait fish, our birds, our mammals. Wetlands are a highly valuable resource. So back to the lake levels question. Great Lakes wetlands, which I'll get to in a second, are really in jeopardy. But Great Lakes wetlands are maintained basically by fluctuations in lake levels. And some of the islands as well, the amount of vegetation is regulated by fluctuations in lake levels. This is, I think, Lake Huron, and this is a lake level chart. And I just want to point this out. When people talk about the average lake level in a Great Lakes, there is no such thing. I mean, there is an average, but the average happens as often as the low or the high happens, right? The Great Lakes levels are always fluctuating. This is a natural part of the Great Lakes ecosystem, is that the lake levels go up, they go down. There's sort of short-term cycles and long-term cycles. But you can see, there's a significant variation in the lake levels. They go up, they go down, they go up, they go down. And that up and down has been part of what species have evolved to that use the nearshore areas and the wetlands. Because when the water levels go up, it actually kills back woody vegetation. And woody vegetation is the bane of a lot of species that like emergent vegetation or marsh vegetation. And so when the water levels go up, it kills back the woody vegetation. As it goes down, those wetlands grow back out, the emergent vegetation grows back out, and the woody vegetation comes back in. And it's a natural cycle that goes back and forth. It's sort of this battle between woody vegetation, things with woody stems, and sort of emergent vegetation and other types of marsh vegetation. So just pointing out that the lake level fluctuations are a very natural part of the Great Lakes ecosystem, an important part. They're, the only two major points we can control lake levels, the Sioux Locks and the St. Lawrence Seaway, whatever canal it is down there, I can't remember the name of it. Welland, thank you. Lake Ontario, it doesn't matter. It's not part of Ireland. Yeah, so those are the two places we can regulate lake levels. And there's a lot of debate in Lake Ontario about this issue with lake level fluctuations, and people not wanting it to fluctuate, but it being a very important part of maintaining things. We don't have as much of that issue in Lake Superior. It's such a big lake, the lake levels fluctuate a lot less than Lake Superior. And Huron and Michigan, you can't really regulate, so they just do their thing. But they are a natural park, and that's what maintains our wetlands, and that's what allows a lot of birds.
I understand it's a big problem in our own area.
Yeah, because they can regulate it a lot more because they have the Welland Canal there. And I mean, this year they're massive.
Lake Ontario though would be it's below Niagara.
Right.
I think it flows freely out through St. Lawrence.
Yeah, but it's how much they let in that will raise the levels versus stopping it. So this year there was record high water levels, and people's homes were going under the water, and so there's a lot of debate. But if they didn't let water in continue to go into Lake Ontario, they were going to have flooding of like major cities in Canada. So they had to let water out, and people were like, "Don't do that." And they're like, "If we do that, then we're going to see a city underwater." So it's a very tough issue. We're getting way off track from birds here, though. Fascinating issue, though. So wetlands, though, super important. If you look at this wetland map, this is nearshore or Great Lakes wetlands. You see a lot more up here than you do down here. We've lost 50% of our wetlands, and in some areas, particularly in the urban areas, Chicago, Detroit, Western Basin Lake area, we've seen 85 to 95% of wetlands lost. The cool thing, though, is that the Great Lakes in the eastern UP, the Great Lakes wetlands up here, we have a lot, and they're very high quality still. We don't have as many problems. We have problems with invasive species, but we have great conservation districts up here that fight those invasive species and have kept them out significantly more so than downstate, where a certain one called Phragmites has just taken over wetland, coastal wetlands downstate. Up here, we are fighting the fight, and it is staying out much more so. So this is the Sioux area. You can just see all these different colors of different types of wetlands. Super significant amount of them, and they're very high quality. And that quality of a wetland is really important. We restore a lot of wetlands, particularly downstate, some up here. Whenever somebody destroys a wetland, they have to build a new wetland or offset that somehow. But what they find is that impacted wetlands, restored wetlands, don't have the biodiversity that reference wetlands do. This is from a study that looked at reference wetlands, which are undisturbed wetlands, versus impacted wetlands or restored wetlands, and the biodiversity is much higher in the reference ones. So back to the birds, I'm just going to point out really quick. I'm not going to get into all the types of wetlands, but we have some really cool wetlands. This is Manuskin Bay. Anybody fished out there before or gone out there? It's a beautiful area. It's really underutilized. There's an awesome campground there, and man-made dikes are up here they were to restore some wetland. They actually now have breached them. They have restored some wetland, but it was sort of, at first it was, hey, I'm not going to do all that. But you can walk along them. That's the point. You can walk along them, particularly in the spring before the vegetation gets really high or early summer. And this is just a beautiful place. And it's every kind of wetland vegetation you could want. You have sedge meadows, you have bulrush, you have cattail, you have all these different native kind of microcosms. And that place is my favorite place to go birding. This is a yellow rail. It's a state special concern species, and they nest out there in significant numbers, although I've yet to see one. They are nocturnal, they are tiny, they don't fly very often, they walk, and you pretty much just have to hear them, and their sound is a very subtle tapping. You take two quarters tapped together, that's exactly what they sound like. So I'm going to keep trying, but I've gone out there at 2, 3 in the morning a few times to try to hear them. I haven't yet, but I know they're out there. They've done surveys. This is a black rail. It's an almost totally misunderstood or non-understood species. The only state record of one came from the Manuskin potholes there. And then black terns, which are another state special concern species. This is another species of tern that's seen huge losses. They nest literally on piles of floating bulrush. Like you see, like out in the wetland, a little pile of floating vegetation. You're like, well, that's just floating vegetation. Well, for them, that's their nest. They sit right on this little flat mat of clumped up bulrush. It's so fragile, so scary, but that's how they raise their young, and they do it in colonies. And I counted this spring around 50 or 60 birds out there. It's one of the healthiest populations we have in the state of black tern. And we have these on multiple places around the St. Mary's region. Drummond Island has 3 or 4 different colonies. The Leishman Islands has 2 or 3. Up here in St. Mary's, I don't know how many, but quite a few, I would assume. So really cool species, needs the high quality wetland. We have it, and it's doing well. So that's just a few examples of these kind of specialty wetland species that we have high quality wetlands for. And that about wraps up, my time and what I have, but I'm happy to take questions in the next 2 minutes here before we wrap things up.
So, I've seen that there's a little island
Uh-huh.
Terns and gulls will colonize the same island?
Yeah, I think so. I'm trying to remember. Terns tend to kick out things better than like the gulls I've seen with the herons, and I've seen them with cormorants. I'm trying to think of seeing gulls and terns. I've seen them close to each other. I don't know if they're right next to each other, but have you seen them on the same island?
Yeah.
Well, there you go. Then they colonize the same island. Yeah, because gulls can be, prey upon young birds, and they, they're scavengers, they're predators. They'll eat whatever they can. But
Well,
yeah,
that's right.
yeah. I mean, there's some, symbionts sometimes between these different species that will accommodate each other during the breeding season. It's really incredible sometimes. We'll nest right next to each other. So, yeah.
Oh, wait.
No.
Are green herons increasing up here?
Are what?
Seems like green herons, I've been seeing more of them.
Have you?
Yeah.
That could
I saw one
definitely
this year,
be.
though.
Green, I saw one this year at Whitefish Point. It's not a common species for the UP. It's, again, we're kind of pushing the northern limits, but we have seen a number of species. I'm trying to think of weapons. I think of more passerine species that have been encroaching farther north. Northern cardinal, Carolina wren, a few other species have been moving farther and farther north. And actually down where black-capped chickadees and Carolina chickadees meet in like Ohio, we've seen that incrementally increase the range. There's a hybrid range where these two species meet up. They're very similar, but they're not very successful, so that hybrid range stays right where the two populations meet. They've measured the pace of that. Every year it moves the same amount or increasing amounts, kind of right in step with climate change. So we're definitely seeing some fluctuation of species due to climate change as they move farther north. We've seen a loss of a lot of our boreal species too. Boreal chickadees are really hard to find up here now. They used to be a lot easier to find, and a lot of people are linking that to climate change. They can be complex too. Some species naturally fluctuate up and down too. Not all climate change, but there's definitely some links that are very clear right to climate change, and we're going to continue to see that undoubtedly. Yeah.
When I was a kid, we used to fish in Betawassee on Sugar Island, and it was known for its black terns.
Oh yeah.
And that was at a time when pollution levels were at all-time highs, and the sewage overflows happen all the time. And now there aren't any there. And so, is there any attempt to? It sounds like you could probably create some habitat, maybe even create some of these floating mats for them or something. Is anything being done to restore those, or why are they disappearing?
Yeah, so Caleb Putnam from Michigan Audubon and Michigan DNR, or Great Lakes Audubon, he does a lot of this research, and I would have to ask him exactly why. I think the loss is mainly from habitat loss. Even though we have wetland laws to protect our wetlands, people still destroy wetlands and then build new wetlands that are really crappy, that didn't accommodate what the old wetlands were. We also see, fluctuations that are natural or not natural. The weird thing is sometimes we have nutrient depletion in areas. We always think of nutrient overload, with Lake Erie always being in the news, but cutting off nutrients by stopping putting sewage in the lawn or getting better laws about what can be in soap and things like that. That could actually mean that now a place gets less nutrients and there's less life growing there, and it's back to more of a natural state, but it might not be a state that accommodated a certain species that we'd like to see in it before.
So what we remember when we were kids is not necessarily natural either.
Nah, right. Our impact is everywhere. You can't escape human impact, so that kind of natural thing is going to happen. And there are some concern. The amount of fish we used to be able to catch might be different now because we're actually putting a lot less nutrients into the Great Lakes, which is a good thing in general. But we also have zebra mussels that are changing nutrient regimes, and we might be nutrient depleted in a lot of our Great Lakes, which are naturally nutrient low lakes anyway. But so it's complex.
Have you been seeing more cranes?
Sandhill cranes?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, sandhill
With
cranes.
our crane foundation, it seems like they might impact, because I'm seeing so many more than I used to.
Yeah, sandhill cranes have, a lot of bird species have done a lot better since the laws in the 70s that were enacted, DDT and other chemicals that were impacting their eggs and things like that. Cranes were ones that have benefited from that. Sandhill cranes. Whooping cranes are the super rare one, but they're actually now breeding in Wisconsin, and they migrate down to Florida. We get 1 or 2 every year that show up in Michigan now. It's really cool. But yeah, the populations seem to be going up. They're at the point now where they're considering actually the hunt season for them, because there's such a high population that that would be a viable thing to do at this point. They hunt them out west, where the population is much larger. Yeah, so that's just, and no, not everyone likes that, but it is an indication that the populations are much higher, or at higher levels than they used to. Whether or not it should happen, you can leave that up to you. Any other questions? All right, we're past 1:30 now, so.
If you can here.
I'll leave my contact info up there for a second. If anyone ever has any questions,